Well, anyway, lots of you then alluding to the rise in population and why perhaps that is to blame for some of the housing situation. Let's cast our mind back then, shall we, to summer 2019. There was lots of talk from Boris Johnson, do you remember, in advance of the election, about what immigration could perhaps look like. Let's remind ourselves.
The immigration system must change. For years, politicians have promised the public an Australian-style points-based system, and today I will actually deliver on those.
Did he? Is that what we've got? Have we got this turbocharged economy because of these high-skilled, well-controlled immigration systems in this country? I'm laughing because we all know it's not true. Anyway, Matt Goodwin, you've written a very interesting article. You can see it on his Twitter. I would recommend you all take a read of it. Essentially, you're not pulling your punches. You're saying that the Tories have sold a big lie. Essentially, the immigration scheme is one big fat Ponzi scheme.
That's exactly what I think. I think basically Boris Johnson and the Tories are lying to the British people. Why do I say that? Because we were promised a highly skilled, high wage, highly selective immigration system. That was the whole promise after Brexit. If you look at the latest data that's just come out on what is actually happening in Britain, we've been given the complete opposite of that. We've been given low skill, low wage, uncontrolled mass migration. If you look, for example, at the number of people coming into Britain from outside of Europe over the last 2 years, we had about 2 million people coming into Britain. What percentage of those 2 million people do you think came in for work?
Well, I know the answer because I've read your article.
15%, 1 in 8. Who are the rest? International students, the relatives of workers, the relatives of those students, asylum seekers, refugees, people on humanitarian routes. The key point is, by liberalising the entire system, by allowing a much larger number of international students, many of whom go to second-rate universities, many of whom drop out of their studies, many of whom work in low-wage jobs, they don't contribute overall to the economy, they tend to take more out than they put in, and by massively expanding the social care visa system, whereby people are coming in on minimum wage jobs, what the Conservatives have done, Michelle, is they've created a massive Ponzi scheme, whereby we've got millions of people coming in who are not contributing more to the economy than they're taking out, and who in time are going to need to be looked after and cared for with public services and so on and so on. And this is the very opposite of what Boris Johnson and the Tories promised after the Brexit referendum. We haven't got a high-skill immigration policy. We've got a low-skill immigration policy. We haven't got a highly selective system, Michelle. We've got a system which basically isn't really very selective at all. And the end result of all this is the continuation of an economy based on mass migration, which companies love because it keeps profits high and it keeps consumption high, but it keeps labour costs low, and it fuels a housing crisis, and it undermines social cohesion. And it's why so many people watching this show out there can now sense what is happening in the country. And I think they're fed up of it. I think they want radical change. And I think somebody needs to be straight with the British people and tell them what's happening.
I'm going to come back to you on a few of those points, but before I do, Paul Embry.
Yeah, for me, it's simple. Either you believe in regulation of the labour supply or you believe in open borders. If you believe in regulation of the labour supply, and I do, then you assess the nation's needs in terms of skills and productivity and wages and housing and community cohesion. I'm on the left, but I do understand that that's an important thing. And then you devise a plan, and then you work around that plan, and you make sure that numbers are not so excessive that it creates the kind of tensions and the downward pressure on wages in some sectors, if we're honest about it, that it's created in Britain, particularly over the last, I would say, couple of decades. And what we've got, and it's very difficult to disagree with Matt on this, we do have a broken system. We've got a broken immigration system, and the problem is it's been broken for years and years, and no one looks as though they are capable of fixing it, and no one looks within the upper echelons of politics in this country that they've got any idea of how to fix it. And anyone who thought at the top of our society that that state of affairs was not going to result in blowback, was not going to result in an increase in what some people call populism, was not for the Labour Party, who facilitated a lot of this stuff, going to result in the hemorrhaging of the working class vote, which it did, I think was naive in the extreme. And I've said on this show previously, Michelle, I think The tragedy is it has made immigration a running sore again in our society, where it had largely been put to bed. I think the complete lack of regulation
Had it
over the
been put
last
to
2
bed?
years.
Well, I'll tell you
Well,
what's
I think
happened.
largely, I think it had in the 80s and 90s. We had the National Front in the 70s, were on the march, and then in the 80s and 90s, I think there was a general feeling that numbers were modest and it was under control. And then with the impacts of free movement and globalisation around the turn of the century, and then EU enlargement in 2004, the thing suddenly exploded again.
But Paul, you see, this is what frustrates me about this debate, because whenever we talk about the problems with mass migration, inevitably, people on the left, many of your fellow activists and so on, will say, oh, it's far right to talk about these issues. And what they'll try and do is close down this debate. They'll make it socially unacceptable to point to what is actually happening on the ground. What is happening on the ground, I think, is deeply disturbing. If you look at, for example, how immigration is being used as a short-term fix to avoid us dealing with actual problems. I work in the universities, OK? So what's happening in the universities? People out there think international students, great, they're going to Oxbridge, they're going to become scientists, they're studying PhDs. That's not what's happening. Most of the people coming over are doing one-year courses, MA courses at second or third-rate universities. They're bringing relatives with them. Once they're in the country, they're free to work. Once they finish their studies, they can work at any skill level, on any salary, without any official sponsor. This is what the Conservatives introduced, OK? So what happens? We don't fix the higher education system because we're using immigrants to basically stop us from dealing with the problem. Social care is the same issue, Michelle. Social care, what we're doing, we're bringing in a couple of 100,000 people on minimum wage, rather than reforming the system, rather than paying workers more, rather than giving councils more funding so they can give the companies more money to professionalise the social care workforce. So what's happening? Again, Conservatives using mass immigration to stop them from having to actually fix the underlying problem. And I think people out there watching the show can see what's going on, and I think they're sick of this debate being curtailed by people screaming at them saying they're far right simply for raising these problems.
I think that's largely fair in terms of your critique on the left, and I've had this debate with people on the left myself many, many times, because I stand in opposition to some of them, a lot of them on this subject. But what I would say on that is at the same time the language has got to be temperate, because we are talking about human beings and we're talking about people who are trying to make a better life for themselves, and I take a strong line on borders and regulation of the labour supply, as most people on the left used to do. Nowadays, most of them arguably are in favour of the open borders position. But even I actually get queasy when I hear Suella Braverman use language like invasion. I don't think that's appropriate. I think the language like an invasion, when people hear the word invasion, they think there's an army at the door, or they think there's, a navy sailing across the sea with guns and whatever to invade. I think that is most people's understanding of
that
invasion.
word has got multiple usage, hasn't it? I mean, when you talk about pitch invasions, you don't start thinking about navies at your door.
What you're talking about is when people use the word invasion, they're talking about people who are coming to plant their flag on your territory and colonise you. That's what most people in geographical terms and political terms, territorial terms, that's what most people understand by the word.
Before this debate gets by the word invasion, and I polled that statement, by the way, more than half of Brits do think the small boat crisis is an invasion, and they agree with Suella Braverman. But going back to this point, look, the Conservatives came out the gate after Brexit and they said Australian-based point system, we'll get the best of the best, we'll get the best global talent, we'll have better schools, better NHS, and we'll get rid of unskilled, uncontrolled immigration. We now know, in 2024, looking around Britain, that was a lie. It was a big Tory lie. I've written about it in detail. I urge people to read it. We need leaders who are honest with British people. We need leaders to tell the truth.
Right, but hold on, because if James Cleverly was sitting here now, he would say...
I'd love that.
He would say that lots of the points that have been made there about students bringing over the dependents and all the rest of it, he would acknowledge was an issue. Suella Braverman, she announced changes back in May last year. Some of them came into force in January this year, which meant that actually a lot of what you're talking about, students bringing people over en masse, that will now massively be restricted to things like PhDs. The skills shortage occupation list, that will be shrunk down. The 20% discount will be removed.
Michelle, hang on.
He will be going on and on.
You know
and
what
like
I'd say to James Cleverly if he was here?
What?
Right, firstly, what he said is international students and their dependents will be limited unless they're studying research degrees. So what they're going to do and what the universities are going to do is change the master's programs and say, well, these are one-year research degrees. It's not going to change anywhere near as much as the Conservative Party thinks it is. The second thing where Mr Cleverly is wrong on this is the social care visa is exempt from changes to the shortage occupation list. We're still going to have hundreds of thousands of people coming in to work low-wage jobs because we can't be bothered to reform the system.
Well, there you go. What do you make to it all? I'm telling you now, if James Cleverly was here, he would be shouting that they are trying very hard to reform that system. But is it enough? You tell me.